The moment my 5-year-old granddaughter looked up at me with those innocent eyes and said, "Daddy told me Grandma's house is going to be ours soon," my blood ran cold, because at that exact moment, I realized this was never about love. It was never about family. It had always been about one thing, and I had exactly 72 hours to stop it. The sweet potato pie was still warm on the counter when my granddaughter said the thing that stopped my heart. She was sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor, arranging her plastic horses into a circle, the way she always did on Sunday afternoons. 5 years old, gap-toothed, wearing the little yellow sundress her mama had put her in that morning. She wasn't even looking at me when she said it, just moved one of her horses to the other side of the circle and announced it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Daddy told me Grandma's house is going to be ours soon." I was standing at the sink, rinsing the last of the dishes from lunch. My hands kept moving. The water kept running, but something inside me went absolutely still. I turned off the faucet slowly, dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. Then I walked over and lowered myself onto the floor beside her, the way I used to sit with her mama when Bella was small. "Is that right, baby?" I said. I kept my voice soft, easy, like we were talking about the weather. "When did Daddy tell you that?" She picked up a spotted brown horse and made it gallop across the tile. "I don't know. A while ago, he said we were going to have a big yard and I could have a real dog." She looked up at me, then eyes bright. "Can I have a dog, Grandma, a fluffy one?" I smiled. I held that smile like my life depended on it. "We'll see about that, sweetheart." She went right back to her horses. Just like that. Completely unbothered, the way only children can be when they've said something that quietly rearranges the whole world. I sat with her for another 20 minutes. I asked about her kindergarten class, about her best friend, about the songs she'd been learning. I poured her a small glass of apple juice. I braided one section of her hair the way she liked. And when her father pulled into my driveway, right at 4 o'clock, to pick her up, I walked her to the door with my hand on her little shoulder and waved them off with the same smile I'd been wearing since she sat on my kitchen floor. Trevor gave me a 2-finger wave from the driver's window. That easy, confident wave he always had. Like a man without a single complicated thought in his head. I waved back. I watched the car disappear around the corner. Then I closed the front door, and I stood in my entryway, in the quiet, and I let the smile go. My name is Gloria Reyes Whitman. For 30 years, I worked my way up from a junior loan officer at a small community bank in Houston, Texas, to regional director of one of the largest financial institutions in the Southwest. I spent 3 decades learning how to read numbers, read people, and read the space between what someone says and what they actually mean. My late husband, Ray, used to joke that I could smell a bad deal from across a parking lot. He wasn't entirely wrong. I retired 2 years ago, 8 months after Ray passed away from a heart condition that took him faster than either of us expected. We had built a good life together in this house, a 4-bedroom craftsman in a quiet neighborhood near Rice University, the kind of street where people still wave from their porches and kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on. After Ray was gone, the house felt bigger than it used to. But it was mine. It was ours. And I had never once considered giving it up. That Sunday evening, I sat down at the kitchen table where Ray and I used to have our morning coffee, and I let myself think. 8 months. That was how long my daughter Bella had been married to Trevor Whitfield. 8 months since the small garden wedding, since the champagne toasts, since I told myself the unease I felt was just a mother's natural reluctance to let go. 8 months of watching small things that I couldn't quite name. A comment here, a look there. The way Bella's voice had changed on the phone, not all at once, but gradually, like a song slowly losing its melody. And now this, a 5-year-old girl, innocent as morning, telling me her father had already decided what would happen to my home. I got up from the table and walked to the hallway. On the wall near the coat closet hung a framed photograph of Ray and me on our 25th anniversary, him in his good blue jacket, me laughing at something he'd just said. I looked at it for a moment. Then I reached behind the frame and felt for the small, brass key I kept there. I used it to unlock the narrow drawer in the hallway cabinet. Inside was a plain, black notebook, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. Nothing on the cover, nothing to suggest what was inside. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat back down. Outside, the last of the evening light was fading over the rooftops. The neighborhood was settling into its Sunday quiet. I could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower, the bark of a dog 2 streets over, the ordinary sounds of ordinary life continuing on around me. I opened the notebook to the first page. For the past 30 days, I had been writing things down. Small things mostly, dates and conversations and details that individually meant nothing but together had begun to form a shape I didn't like. I had told myself I was being careful, that I was being thorough, that this was just something I did, a habit left over from 30 years of working in a world where documentation was everything. But sitting at that table on that Sunday evening with my granddaughter's cheerful voice still ringing in my ears, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. I walked to the drawer, pulled out the small notebook, and opened it to the first page. For the first time, I wasn't reading it as a worried mother. I was reading it as someone who finally knew what she was looking for. The first entry in that notebook was dated 8 months ago, written in my own handwriting on a Tuesday night after a dinner I couldn't stop thinking about. 8 months ago, I thought Trevor Whitfield was the answer to every mother's prayer. I know how that sounds now. But you have to understand, when you've spent 30 years reading financial statements and loan applications, when you've sat across the desk from hundreds of people and learned to separate the ones who would make good on their word from the ones who wouldn't, you start to believe in your own judgment. You start to trust it the way you trust your own 2 feet on solid ground. I trusted mine with Trevor, for a little while anyway. My daughter, Isabella Bella, we've always called her, was 31 years old when she met him. She had her father's dark eyes and my stubborn streak, and she had built herself a good life in the marketing department of a mid-sized tech firm downtown. She owned her own condo in Midtown, drove herself to work every morning, called me on Sunday afternoons without fail. After Ray passed, those Sunday calls became something I held on to more than I ever told her. Bella met Trevor at a fundraising gala for the Houston Children's Museum, the kind of event where the wine is expensive and everyone is trying to impress someone. She called me the next morning, and I could hear something in her voice I hadn't heard in a while, a lightness, like a window had been opened somewhere. "Mom," she said, "I met someone. Trevor Whitfield," she told me, was 38 years old and ran his own technology startup, focused on real estate software. He was originally from Dallas, had gone to school in Austin, and had been living in Houston for the past 4 years. He was charming, she said. Smart. He made her laugh. I met him for the first time 6 weeks later at a Sunday dinner at my house. He arrived with a bottle of good red wine and a firm handshake and a smile that I can only describe as practiced, not fake exactly, but precise. The kind of smile that lands exactly where it's supposed to land every single time. He complimented my cooking. He asked thoughtful questions about the neighborhood. He talked about his work with just enough enthusiasm to sound passionate, without crossing into boastful. When Bella got up to help me clear the plates, he stood up too without being asked and carried the serving dishes to the kitchen counter. Small thing, but I noticed it. Over dinner, he asked about my career. I told him the broad strokes, 30 years in banking, retired now, keeping busy. He leaned forward slightly when I talked the way people do when they're genuinely interested. He asked follow-up questions. He said things like, "That must have taken real discipline," and "I can only imagine what you saw over those 30 years. It was all very smooth, very warm, very right." And yet, there was a moment, just one early in the evening, when Bella started telling a story about a campaign she had led at work, something she was clearly proud of. She was maybe 3 sentences in when Trevor turned to me and said, "She's brilliant at her job, always has been." He said it with a smile, the way you'd brag about someone you loved. But Bella's sentence never finished. She just laughed softly and let it go the way you do when you've learned that certain doors don't stay open long. I filed that away. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being the kind of mother who sees problems that aren't there, the kind Ray used to gently tease me about. I told myself Trevor was just enthusiastic, just proud of her. By the time he left that evening, he had called me by my first name exactly 3 times. Not too familiar, not too formal. He thanked me for dinner with what felt like genuine warmth. He held the door open for Bella as they walked to his car. I stood on the porch and watched them go, and I thought, he's very good at this. I wasn't sure yet what this was. They moved quickly. Within 4 months, Bella had given up her Midtown condo and moved into Trevor's house in the Heights neighborhood, a renovated Craftsman, not unlike mine, with a wide front porch and a big oak tree in the backyard. 2 months after that, he proposed at a restaurant she'd loved since college. She called me from the parking lot, still in her good dress, crying happy tears into the phone. The wedding was small and lovely, held in the garden of a bed and breakfast outside the city on a Saturday afternoon in October. Bella wore a simple ivory dress and carried white dahlias. Trevor wore a charcoal suit and looked at her the way men look at things they intend to keep. I danced with my son-in-law that evening. He was a good dancer. Of course he was. It was about 3 weeks after the wedding that Trevor first asked about my finances. We were sitting in Bella's new kitchen, their kitchen, on a weeknight, the 3 of us, eating takeout from the Thai place around the corner. Bella had stepped out to take a work call, and Trevor and I were talking about the neighborhood, about property values, about the way Houston had changed since I'd moved there with Ray decades ago. He asked how long I'd been in my house. I told him over 20 years. He nodded impressed. Property in that area has appreciated significantly, he said. You made a smart investment back then. We weren't thinking about investment, I said. We were thinking about where we wanted to raise our family. He smiled at that. That's what I mean. That kind of instinct that's rare. I'd love to pick your brain sometime, if you're open to it. About long-term financial strategy. About how you think about assets. 30 years in banking. That's a wealth of experience I could actually learn from. It was flattering. It was meant to be. I said, sure, sometime in the casual way, you agree to things over takeout on a Tuesday night without thinking too much about them. Bella came back from her call, and the conversation moved on, and I didn't think about it again until I was driving home and something small and quiet tugged at the back of my mind. Not a red flag, not even close to that. Just a note, the way a single instrument in an orchestra plays slightly off pitch, and most people don't catch it. I caught it. I just didn't know yet what it meant. Trevor smiled and said he admired everything I had built. What I didn't know then was that he had been studying everything I had built long before he ever walked through my door. The changes were small at first. They always are. That's the thing. Nobody tells you about this kind of situation. There's no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it started. There's no door that slams, no voice that rises, no obvious line being crossed. It's quieter than that. It's a slow rearrangement of small things, so gradual you almost don't notice it happening, until one day you look up and the person you love is standing right in front of you, and something essential about them has shifted. In the first weeks after the wedding, everything seemed fine. Bella called me on Sundays the way she always had. She sounded happy, maybe a little tired, but newly married, tired, the kind that comes from building a shared life and figuring out whose habits go where. Trevor sent me a thoughtful text message on my birthday. They had me over for dinner twice in the first month. Things seemed, by every visible measure, good. But I was watching. I've always been a watcher. Ray used to say, I absorbed a room the way other people absorbed sunshine quietly, completely, without making a show of it. The first thing I noticed was the Sunday calls getting shorter. Not dramatically shorter. Not the kind of change you'd notice if you weren't paying attention. But where we used to talk for 45 minutes an hour, sometimes, suddenly we were wrapping up in 20. And Bella's voice had a quality to it I hadn't heard before. Not unhappy exactly, but careful, measured. Like she was choosing her words with a little more deliberation than usual. Once I asked her how things were going at work. She started to tell me about a project she'd been leading, something she was clearly proud of, and then paused mid-sentence and said, "Actually, Trevor thinks I should consider transitioning to something with more stable hours. We're still talking about it." I asked what she thought about it. There was a small silence. "I think he makes a good point," she said. I let it go. I told myself that was what marriage looked like. Compromise, consideration, factoring in another person's perspective. I told myself I was projecting. The second thing I noticed was Trevor's habit of answering for her. It happened in small ways, in casual settings. We'd be sitting around their dining table, and someone would ask Bella a question. What did she want to do for the holidays? How did she feel about a particular restaurant? What were their plans for the summer? And before she could open her mouth, Trevor would answer, smoothly, confidently, as if it were perfectly natural. Sometimes he'd glance at her afterward, like he was offering her the chance to add something. She rarely did. The third dinner I attended at their house, I watched this happen 4 times in one evening. Bella moved around her own kitchen with a kind of careful efficiency. That night, refilling glasses, checking the oven, wiping down the counter between courses. She was a good hostess. She had always been gracious. But there was something different about the way she moved that evening. Less ease, more precision, like she was performing a role she had memorized rather than simply being at home in her own space. At one point, she dropped a serving spoon on the tile floor, and the small clatter of it made her flinch in a way that seemed disproportionate to the noise. She picked it up quickly, glanced toward the living room, where Trevor was talking, and then carried on without a word. I noticed I didn't say anything. After dinner, while Trevor was in the other room taking a work call, Bella and I stood in the kitchen, washing up together, the way we had 1,000 times before. I handed her a dish to dry and said as casually as I could manage, "You seem tired, baby." She looked at me for just a moment, one of those looks that carries more than it's willing to say, and then she smiled and shook her head. "Just a lot going on," she said. "You know how it is?" I did know how it was. I also knew that particular smile. It was the smile of someone who had decided for reasons of their own that certain things were not up for discussion. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the garage for a few minutes before going inside. The house was quiet around me. Ray's old truck was still parked in its spot, the way I'd left it, the way I couldn't quite bring myself to change. I sat there in the dark, and I thought about Bella's flinch when the spoon hit the floor, about the 4 unanswered questions, about the voice on the phone that was getting quieter every Sunday. The next morning, I went to the drugstore and bought a plain black notebook. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was the kind of mother who looks for trouble because she has too much time on her hands. I told myself that Bella was a grown woman who had made her own choices and deserved to have those choices respected. But I had also spent 30 years in rooms where people made decisions about money, about other people's money, and I had learned something in those rooms that I couldn't unlearn. Patterns don't announce themselves. They accumulate, and by the time most people notice them, they've already been going on for a while. So I started writing things down. Dates, conversations, small details. The way you document weather before a storm, not because you know exactly what's coming, but because you understand that the atmosphere has changed and you want a record of when you first felt it. I told myself I was imagining things, but I had spent 30 years watching people make decisions with other people's money. And something about Trevor Whitfield didn't sit right. I just couldn't name it yet. The first time Trevor came to me with a business proposition, he didn't call it asking for help. He called it giving me an opportunity. That distinction matters more than it might seem. In 30 years of banking, I sat across from a lot of people who needed things from me. The ones who said so plainly, who came in with their numbers and their honest ask, those were the people I respected most, even when I had to say no. But there was another kind of person who walked through those doors, the kind who reframed the whole conversation before it started, Who made you feel like you were the lucky one? Who turned their need into your privilege? Trevor was that second kind. He called me on a Wednesday morning about 2 months after the wedding and asked if I'd come by his office that Friday. He had something he wanted to share with me, a project. He thought my perspective would be valuable. His office was on the 4th floor of a glass building near the Galleria, the kind of address that suggested success without quite confirming it. Good lighting, exposed brick, a logo on the wall that looked expensive. Trevor met me at the conference room door personally. Jacket-pressed energy calibrated to exactly the right level of calm confidence. The table had printed materials at each place and a presentation already loaded on the screen. The pitch was polished. I'll give him that. His company was a real estate technology platform, connecting property developers with investors through a proprietary matching algorithm. The slides were clean, full of market data, and projected growth curves, and the kind of language that sounds authoritative until you start pulling at the threads. I sat quietly and listened. 30 years of sitting in rooms like this had taught me that the most useful thing you can do early in any financial conversation is say as little as possible and notice as much as you can. By the third slide, I had found the first problem. The revenue projections showed consistent 30% growth quarter over quarter for 2 years straight. For a platform of this size and age in the current market, those numbers weren't just optimistic. They were disconnected from reality in a way that either reflected genuine ignorance or a deliberate choice to impress people who wouldn't look too closely. The second problem was the exit valuation. The investor returns. He projected assumed a price to revenue multiple I had not seen achieved in this sector outside of a handful of exceptional cases over the past decade. The math required a chain of assumptions that were never stated, just baked into the numbers as if they were facts. I noted both. I kept my face open and attentive. When he finished, Trevor leaned back with the satisfied ease of a man who believed the hard part was over. "So," he said, "what do you think?" "It's impressive," I said. "You've clearly put real work into this. I do have a few questions, if you don't mind." He spread his hands. "That's exactly why I wanted you here." I asked about the revenue projections. Specifically, what assumptions were driving the growth rate, and whether they had been validated independently. He answered smoothly, citing market trends and user acquisition data. When I pressed on specifics, the specifics softened into generalities. I asked about the institutional partners listed on one of the slides, listed by category, but not by name. In my experience, companies with legitimate backing name their backers. They want you to know. He said he wasn't at liberty to name them at this stage, but assured me they were well-established players. He said it with perfect confidence, the way you say something you've rehearsed. At the end, he told me he was opening a small investment round to a select group of people he trusted. He mentioned a figure. Not small, but not outrageous. 18 months to return conservative estimate. "I don't need an answer today," he said. "I just wanted you to hear about it from me directly. You've built something real, Gloria. I'd rather have people like you involved than anyone else." I told him I appreciated him thinking of me and would give it serious consideration. I shook his hand. I drove home, went straight to the kitchen table, and opened my notebook to a fresh page. I wrote down every number he had mentioned, every claim, every gap I had identified. Not with emotion, with precision, the way I had been trained. Then I picked up my phone and called a man I had worked alongside for nearly 15 years before I retired, a former colleague who now ran his own independent financial analysis firm. His name was James Okafor, and he was one of the sharpest people I had ever known. If something was buried in Trevor's numbers, James would find it. I explained the situation briefly. Told him I needed a company looked at quietly. No formal engagement, just a preliminary read. He said he'd see what he could pull together. James called me back in less than 24 hours. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who had found something he wasn't sure he should say out loud. "Gloria," he said slowly, "where did you say you met this man?" There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over you when you are driving toward news you are not sure you want to hear. I had felt it before, sitting in a hospital waiting room when Ray's doctors asked to speak with us privately, standing outside a conference room before a meeting I knew was going to change things. It is not fear exactly. It is more like a heightened awareness of the present moment, a kind of stillness that comes from understanding that the world on the other side of the next few minutes is going to look different from the world on this side. That was how I felt, driving across Houston to meet James the morning after his call. He had asked me to come to his office rather than discuss it over the phone. That alone told me something. James Okafor was not a man who avoided directness out of social discomfort. If he wanted to have this conversation in person, it was because what he had found deserved to be handled carefully. His firm occupied a modest suite in a low-rise building in the Greenway Plaza area, the kind of office that prioritized function over impression, which had always suited him. He was waiting for me when I arrived, standing near the window with a coffee mug and an expression I recognized from years of working alongside him. It was his thinking face, the one he wore when he was choosing his words. "Thanks for coming in," he said, shaking my hand. "Sit down." He had a folder open on the desk. Not thick, but substantial. He had been busy. "I want to be clear about something before I start," he said, settling into his chair. "Nothing I found rises to the level of confirmed wrongdoing. What I found are irregularities, patterns, the kind of thing that on its own could have an innocent explanation. But taken together," he paused, "taken together, they paint a picture I wouldn't feel right about not sharing with you." I nodded. "Tell me." He walked me through it methodically, the way he had always worked. No editorializing, just the facts laid out in sequence. The company's financial filings showed a pattern of revenue recognition that was at minimum aggressively optimistic. Expenses were structured in ways that obscured where money was actually going. There were two entities connected to the company that appeared to serve no clear operational purpose, holding structures essentially that received transfers from the main operating account without a transparent explanation for what those transfers were for. This kind of structure, James said carefully, is sometimes used legitimately for tax purposes or liability management, but it can also be used to move funds in ways that are difficult to trace. Without a full audit, I can't tell you which it is. I asked him if Trevor had any history with regulatory bodies. James opened the folder to a specific page and turned it toward me. There had been an inquiry several years ago, not a formal investigation, just a preliminary review that was ultimately closed without action. The details were sparse, as these things often are, when nothing is ultimately proven. But the inquiry had been initiated following a complaint from a former business partner who alleged that funds had been misrepresented in a joint venture. The complaint was withdrawn before it went anywhere. "Withdrawn how?" I asked. James shrugged slightly. "The record doesn't say. Could be a settlement. Could be the complainant decided it wasn't worth pursuing. Could be other reasons." I looked at the page for a moment. Then I asked the question I had been building toward since I sat down. "Is there anything else?" James closed the folder and placed his hands flat on top of it. "There is one more thing," he said, "and I want to be careful about how I present this because it's personal information, and I don't want to overstate what it means." I waited. "Trevor Whitfield was married once before," James said. "About 6 years ago. The marriage lasted roughly 2 years and ended in divorce. His former wife's name was Sandra Mitchell. She was a physician, had a solid practice-owned property, had built up significant savings over about a decade of work." He paused. "After the divorce, she sold her practice, sold her home. She moved out of the city. As far as I can tell from what's publicly available, she has kept a very low profile since then. No professional presence, no community involvement. She essentially stepped back from everything she had built." The room was quiet for a moment. "Do you know why I asked?" "No," James said. "The divorce records are sealed. I don't have access to what happened between them." He looked at me steadily. But the timing of her withdrawal from everything it happened very quickly after the divorce was finalized. Within a few months. I sat with that for a moment. A physician, a decade of work, a life carefully built. And then, within a few months of a divorce, all of it quietly set aside. I thanked James, shook his hand, and drove home. I took the long way back down Westheimer, through the old neighborhood where Ray and I had lived when we first moved to Houston, past the elementary school where Bella had learned to read. I wasn't ready to sit in my house yet, with everything James had told me. At a red light, I thought about something Trevor had said at dinner, maybe 3 weeks after the wedding. We had been talking about the neighborhood, about property, about how the city had grown. And he had turned to me with that easy smile and said, almost as an aside, "Have you ever thought about downsizing? A lot of people in your position find it liberating. All that space just for one person." I had laughed it off at the time, told him I wasn't ready for that. He had nodded and moved on, and the conversation had gone somewhere else, and I had forgotten about it until right now. Sitting at that red light, I did not forget about it anymore. Sandra Mitchell. The name meant nothing to me then. But James's expression when he said it, careful, almost reluctant, told me it should. It took me 3 days to find her. James had given me what he could, a last known address from a few years back, a name that had gone quiet in every professional directory I checked. No current listing in any medical board database. No presence anywhere online. Just a woman who had, by every visible measure, simply stopped. The address James had found led me to an apartment complex in Pearland, about 30 minutes south of the city. The kind of place that was clean and well-maintained, but carried the particular atmosphere of somewhere people landed, rather than somewhere they chose. 2-story buildings arranged around a parking lot, identical doors painted the same shade of beige. A small pool that nobody was using on a Tuesday afternoon. I sat in my car for a few minutes before going in. I had thought about what I was going to say the whole drive down. I still wasn't sure. I knocked on the door of Unit 14 on the 2nd floor. There was a long pause. Then the sound of movement inside. Careful and unhurried, the way someone moves when they are deciding whether to answer at all. The woman who opened the door was younger than I expected, mid-40s, with the kind of face that had once been open and is now practiced at being closed. She was wearing a cardigan, despite the warmth of the afternoon, her dark hair pulled back simply. She looked at me with the careful stillness of someone who had learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors. "Sandra Mitchell," I said. A beat of silence. "Who are you?" I told her my name. I told her my daughter had married Trevor Whitfield 4 months ago. I watched her face as I said. It watched something move through her expression that she quickly brought back under control, the way you press a hand against a wound without letting anyone see. "I don't have anything to say about that," she said. Her voice was even, practiced. "I know this said I'm not here to cause you any trouble. I'm not recording this. I'm not working with anyone." I paused. "I'm just a mother who is trying to understand what she is dealing with before it's too late." Sandra looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. The apartment was spare and orderly. A couch, a small dining table, a bookshelf with medical texts that looked like they hadn't been opened in a while. A window that looked out over the parking lot. No photographs on the walls. No personal items on the kitchen counter. It had the quality of a space that had been stripped of history intentionally, like someone had decided that the weight of the past was something they could no longer afford to carry around. She made us both tea without asking if I wanted any. I took that as a good sign. We sat across from each other at the small dining table. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the surface of the tea for a moment before she spoke. "How bad is it?" she asked. I told her what I knew, the pitch, the financial irregularities James had found, the way Bella had changed over the past months, the things I had been writing down in my notebook. I kept it factual. I did not editorialize. When I finished, Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she set her mug down and looked at me directly for the first time. "He met me at a medical conference," she said, "in Dallas. I was 38. I had my own practice, a house I had bought myself, a retirement account I had been building for 11 years. She said it without pride, just the way you state the facts of something that no longer belongs to you. He was charming, attentive. He asked about my work like it mattered to him. She told me the rest, steadily, without rushing. How he had spent the first year building something that felt genuine, trust, warmth, a partnership she had wanted for a long time. How the financial conversations had started small, framed always as opportunities, as ways to grow what she had already built. How she had signed documents she believed she understood because he had explained them in ways that made them sound straightforward, and because she had trusted him, and because trust, she had learned, can make you stop reading the fine print. By the time she realized the full shape of what had happened, the practice had been used as collateral for obligations she hadn't knowingly agreed to. The house was encumbered in ways that made it nearly impossible to keep. Her savings had moved through accounts connected to his business and had not come back. The attorneys told me I could fight it, she said, that some of what he did might be challengeable. But fighting it would have taken years and cost more than what was left. She looked down at her hands. And I was so tired. I was just so tired. She had let it go, closed the practice, sold the house, moved somewhere small and quiet, where she didn't have to explain herself to anyone who had known her before. The hardest part, she said after a moment, wasn't the money. It was understanding that the whole thing from the very beginning had never been what I thought it was. That I had been read the way you read a target. That every conversation, every moment I thought was real had been, she stopped, started again. It changes the way you trust yourself. For a long time, I didn't. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, a car pulled into the parking lot, and a woman got out with 2 bags of groceries and walked toward the stairs without looking up. I have a granddaughter, I said quietly. She's 5 years old. She told me last Sunday that her daddy said Grandma's house was going to be there soon. Sandra closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was something in her expression that I recognized, not pity, but a particular kind of solidarity that only comes from having stood in the same place. Then you don't have much time, she said. I drove back to Houston in the late afternoon light, the skyline rising slowly in my windshield, as I came up the freeway. I thought about Sandra's apartment, about the bare walls and the unread books, and the careful way she held herself like someone still learning how much space they were allowed to take up. I sat in my car outside Sandra's building for a long time. She had lost everything, and my daughter was already 3 steps down the same road. The question was no longer whether Trevor was dangerous. The question was how far back his plan actually went. I have a habit left over from my banking years of spreading things out on a flat surface when I need to understand them, not on a screen, on a table, paper-printed pages, handwritten notes, physical things you can move around and place next to each other and step back from. Ray used to joke that I turned our dining room into a war room every time I was working through a complicated problem. He wasn't wrong. There is something about seeing information laid out in front of you tangibly that a screen cannot replicate. You see connections differently. You see gaps. That evening, I came home from Pearland and I spread everything out. Every page of my notebook, every document James had sent me, the printed slides from Trevor's presentation, which I had kept, a timeline I had started drafting in my head on the drive back, dates, events, the sequence of things as I knew them, which I now wrote out by hand on a fresh sheet of paper and placed at the center of the table. Then I called James. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what Sandra had told me. He listened, without interrupting the way he always did when the information was significant. When I finished, there was a brief silence. I want to look at something, he said. Give me a couple of hours. While I waited, I worked through the timeline myself. I wrote down every interaction I could remember, every dinner, every conversation, every question Trevor had asked me about property values or retirement planning or what I intended to do with the house long term. I wrote down the dates as precisely as I could recall them. I wrote down the event where Bella had met Trevor, the Houston Children's Museum Gala. She had told me about 10 months ago now. James called back 2 hours later. His voice had the quality it got when he was about to say something he had verified carefully and wished he hadn't needed to verify at all. "The gala where Bella met Trevor," he said. "Did she ever mention how he came to be there?" I thought about it. She had told me he was there with a colleague, that they had been introduced through a mutual connection at the event. I told James that. "The mutual connection," James said carefully, "is a man named, well, it doesn't matter who he is. What matters is that this person has a professional relationship with Trevor that goes back several years. And the reason I mention it is because I found something interesting when I looked at Trevor's public records over the past 18 months. He had pulled Trevor's professional history, conference attendances, industry event registrations, the kind of semi-public record that accumulates when you move through professional circles. Cross-referenced against what he could find about my own professional history, my name was still attached to enough publications, board memberships, and industry mentions from my banking years to constitute a fairly detailed public profile. Trevor had attended 2 events in the 18 months before the gala where Bella met him, both of them connected to the banking and financial services industry. Neither had any obvious relevance to his real estate technology business. He was at a retirement symposium, James said, where your name appears in the program as a former keynote speaker. And he was at a luncheon hosted by the Regional Banking Association, an event you had chaired for several years before you retired. I sat very still. He wasn't there for the content, James said. His company had no reason to be represented at either of those events. But your history with both of them is prominently documented. The room felt quieter than it had a moment before. The gala, I said slowly. The gala was hosted by a board that includes 2 people with direct professional ties to your former institution, James said. Trevor's attendance was sponsored, meaning someone paid for his table. The sponsoring party is connected to the mutual acquaintance who introduced him to Bella. I looked down at the timeline on the table in front of me, at the neat line of dates and events I had written out in my own handwriting. I picked up my pen and drew a single line backward from the gala, past the 2 industry events James had described, back further, to the earliest point where Trevor's path could plausibly have intersected with my name. 14 months before he walked through my front door, for the first time there was already a thread connecting him to my world. He had not wandered into Bella's life. He had navigated his way into it, deliberately, methodically, the way you plan a route rather than take a walk. I set the pen down and stood up from the table. I walked to the hallway where the wedding photographs were hung, the ones Bella had given me, framed from the October garden ceremony. She was laughing in one of them, her face turned toward Trevor, her dahlias slightly tilted from the dancing. She looked so entirely happy, so entirely certain. I stood there, looking at that photograph for a long time. I had been angry, before the quiet, managed kind of anger that you keep below the surface, because you know that acting on it before you're ready serves no one. But standing in that hallway, looking at my daughter's face on the happiest day she had believed she was having, something moved through me that was different from that. Sharper, older. It was the anger of understanding, the kind that comes not from what someone did to you, but from the full picture of what they intended. I turned away from the photograph and walked back to the dining room table. I looked at the timeline. I looked at the documents. I looked at 30 years of professional experience laid out in front of me, like a map of everything Trevor had studied before making his move. Trevor Whitfield hadn't fallen in love with my daughter. He had selected her. And that difference, that cold, calculated difference, was the thing that made me pick up my phone and make a call that should have made weeks ago. The call I made that night was to a woman I had known peripherally for several years through the Houston business community, an attorney who had built her practice around financial litigation and white-collar matters, the kind of cases that required patience, precision, and a particular willingness to work through complexity without losing focus. Her name was Diana Chen. We had served on the same nonprofit board briefly years back, and I had watched how she handled a difficult governance dispute that could have fractured the organization quietly, methodically, without drama, with a clarity of purpose that I had respected and remembered. When I needed someone who could look at what I had gathered and tell me honestly what it meant and what could be done. She was the first name that came to mind. She had agreed to see me the following morning. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, understated in the way that serious practices often are good furniture, no unnecessary decoration. The kind of environment that says we do not need to impress you because our work speaks for itself. Her assistant offered me coffee, which I accepted, and showed me to a conference room where Diana was already seated, a legal pad in front of her, a pen in her hand. She stood to greet me with a firm handshake. She was in her mid-50s, trim and composed, with the kind of stillness that comes not from being unfeeling, but from having learned over a long career how to hold space for difficult things without being moved off center by them. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start wherever feels right and don't stop." So I did. I talked for nearly 40 minutes without interruption. I told her about the pitch, about James's findings about Sandra, and the Pearland apartment, and the bare walls, and the years of work that had simply been absorbed and redirected. I told her about the timeline, about the 14 months of apparent preparation, the industry events, the sponsored gala attendance. I told her about my notebook, about the Sunday calls getting shorter, about Bella's voice changing in ways I was only now able to name fully. Diana wrote steadily the whole time, not frantically deliberately, the way someone writes when they are building a structure rather than just taking notes. She did not react visibly to any of it. She did not reassure me or express outrage or offer premature opinions. She just listened and wrote, and the steadiness of that, the simple, professional act of being fully heard without being managed, was something I hadn't realized I needed until it was happening. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at her notes for a moment. "All right," she said. "Here is what I think you are dealing with." She walked me through it clearly and without softening. Based on the pattern James had identified, the irregularities in the company's structure, and Sandra's experience there, was a reasonable basis to believe that what was happening followed a deliberate methodology, one designed to move financial assets through relationships built on manufactured trust. The challenge, she explained, was that this kind of situation was extraordinarily difficult to address through confrontation alone. The moment Trevor understood that Gloria knew what she knew, he would adjust. He would move things. He would create distance between himself and anything that could be examined. "If you confront him now," she said, "you may feel better in the short term, but you will have told him exactly what you know and given him time to respond to it. And someone who has done this before, which the evidence strongly suggests, knows how to respond." I asked her what she recommended instead. She leaned forward slightly. "You continue," she said. "You give him what he expects to see. Someone who is considering his proposal. Someone who is taking her time, being thoughtful, asking reasonable questions. You let him believe the situation is developing the way he planned. While we build the actual case," I said. "While we build what cannot be argued with," she said. "Documentation. A paper trail that tells the story on its own without requiring anyone to take your word for it." She outlined the specifics. I would need to have any further conversations with Trevor in settings where they could be documented. I would need to ask questions that drew out specific representations claims he made about the investment, about timelines, about how funds would be used, that could later be compared against the reality. James would continue his work on the financial side. Diana would begin preparing the legal framework for what came next. She paused, and then she said the thing I had been waiting for her to say. "There is one part of this that is going to be genuinely hard," she said, "and it involves your daughter." I held her gaze. "At some point, you are going to have to make a decision about what Bella knows and when she knows it," Diana said. "If she is aware of any part of what Trevor is doing, even peripherally, that affects how we approach this. And if she is not aware, then bringing her into it too early could create complications that work against you." I thought about Bella's face at the dinner table, about her eyes looking down at her plate, about the careful way she had learned to hold herself in her own home. "I understand," I said. Diana picked up her pen again. "Then we have a plan. We spent another 30 minutes going through the details. What to say, what to ask, what to document, and how. By the time we finished the coffee I had been brought at the start of the meeting was long cold, and the morning had moved well into midday. I gathered my things and stood to leave. Diana walked me to the door of the conference room. At the threshold, she paused. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. I thought about Ray, who had always said that the most important decisions are the ones you make before the moment arrives. I thought about Sandra, sitting in her quiet apartment, with her unread books, having run out of road before she found a way to fight back. I thought about a 5-year-old girl arranging plastic horses on a kitchen floor, saying things she didn't understand. "I've been ready," I said, for longer than I knew. The hardest thing I ever did wasn't confronting Trevor. It was smiling at him across the dinner table and pretending I didn't know exactly what he was. People talk about confrontation like it's the hard part, but the real work happens in the quiet before that, in the steady, deliberate act of holding everything you know behind a pleasant expression, while the person across from you believes they are managing you. That takes something different from courage. It takes the kind of discipline you build over decades, in rooms where showing your hand too early cost people more than they could afford to lose. Trevor called me 4 days after my meeting with Diana. He said Bella had mentioned I might be coming around to his investment proposal, and he wondered if I'd join them for dinner that Friday. "Just family," he said. "Relaxed. No pressure." I said that sounded lovely. Their house looked warm from the street. When I arrived, the porch light on the smell of something good from the kitchen. Bella opened the door and hugged me, and I held her a moment longer than usual before pulling back to look at her face. She looked tired. She smiled anyway. Trevor came from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, easy and welcoming. "Gloria," he said. "So glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said. And so it began. Dinner was a performance on both sides of the table, though only one of us knew that. Trevor was in excellent form, attentive, measured, asking about my week, refilling my water glass without being asked. He talked about the company, about a new partnership in development, framing everything as natural conversation, while actually continuing the pitch. I recognized the structure because I had spent 30 years listening to people dress up financial arguments as casual chat and hope you wouldn't notice the seams. I asked questions, thoughtful ones. How long before the next funding milestone? What did the new partnership mean for investor timelines? He answered each with the confidence of a man who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. I nodded at appropriate intervals. I said things like, "That makes sense, and I can see the logic." Across the table, Bella ate quietly. She contributed occasionally, a small comment, a brief laugh, but mostly, she sat with her attention on her plate. Once, Trevor made a point about property values and glanced at her as if inviting confirmation. She nodded without looking up. I filed that away and kept my expression warm. After dinner, Trevor reached into the leather bag beside his chair and produced a slim folder, setting it on the table between us with practiced ease. "Preliminary documents," he said. "Just a framework so you can see how the structure works. Take it home, look it over." I opened the folder and turned the pages slowly. The presentation was clean and professional. On the third page, near the bottom, was a clause I almost missed, not hidden exactly, but written in a way that buried its significance in the language around it. 3 sentences embedded in a paragraph about collateral structures that outlined a provision allowing the investment vehicle to secure its position through assets held by participating investors. Real property included. I turned to the 4th page. I asked Trevor about the distribution timeline. He explained it. I asked a follow-up. He elaborated. While he was talking, I shifted the folder slightly, angling it toward me. With my phone placed face down beside my plate before I arrived, I pressed the button I had preset without looking down. 1 page, 2, 3, 4, 5. I set the folder down and nodded. "This is helpful," I said. "I'd like to take it home and go through it properly." Trevor smiled the smile of a man watching something fall neatly into place. "Of course," he said. No rush. I looked at Bella then. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her back partially to us stacking rinsed dishes, with the methodical focus of someone who needed something to do with her hands. Then she glanced over her shoulder, not at Trevor, at me, and for just a second, before she looked away again, I saw it. Not the tiredness I had been watching for months, not the careful blankness she had learned to wear. Something more specific, something that sat at the intersection of guilt and grief, in the particular weight of a person who knows more than they are saying and has been living with that knowledge for longer than was good for them. I had seen that look before. In 30 years, I had seen it on the faces of people who understood on some level that something had gone wrong and weren't yet sure what to do about it. I turned back to Trevor and said something pleasant about dessert. That night, I sent the photos to Diana. Her reply came at midnight, 3 words, "We have him." I set my phone down and looked out the window. We had him. But something Diana had said earlier stayed with me. Something about information moving faster than it should. I hadn't understood it then. By morning, I would. Diana called at 7:15 the next morning. I was still in my kitchen, halfway through my first cup of coffee, when my phone lit up with her name. Diana was not the kind of person who called at 7:15 without a reason. I answered before the second ring. "Are you somewhere you can talk?" she asked. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her before, not alarmed, but compressed. Careful in a different way than usual. I set my mug down. "Go ahead." She had been working since early that morning. She told me, cross-referencing the timeline of our investigation against a pattern she had noticed over the past several days. Twice in the past week, Trevor had made moves that seemed to anticipate information she and I had discussed privately. The first time she had noted it and moved on. The second time she had started asking questions. "Someone is telling him things," she said. "Not everything, but enough to give him a sense of how the situation is developing on our end." I stood very still in my kitchen. "How certain are you?" I asked. "Certain enough to call you at 7:15, she said. We spent the next hour going through it together. Diana walking me through the specific instances, the timing of Trevor's responses, the nature of what he seemed to know versus what he couldn't have known through any other means. The circle of people with access to our process was small. Diana's staff handled their own matters under strict confidentiality. That left the people on my side. There was only one name that fit. James Okafor had been my entry point into this entire investigation. He had access to everything I had found, every line of inquiry I had pursued, the general shape of where things were heading. He was also, as Diana pointed out carefully, a person with his own professional history, one that, when she had looked at it that morning, included a joint venture with a real estate technology firm approximately 4 years ago that had ended in a financial dispute. The other party in that dispute had eventually dropped their claim. The other party was Trevor Whitfield. I sat down at the kitchen table. "He's not working against you deliberately," Diana said. "I don't think this is malicious. But Trevor clearly has something on him, some leverage from that old dispute, and James is passing along information to protect himself. People in that position don't always think clearly about who else gets hurt." I thought about James. 15 years of working alongside him. The way he had answered my call, without hesitation, had pulled together information quickly, had seemed genuinely troubled by what he found. None of that had been false, I believed, but it had apparently existed alongside something else, a prior obligation, a vulnerability, a door that Trevor had known how to open. I was quiet for a moment. "All right," I said. "I'm sorry," Diana said. "I know he's someone you trusted." "He is," I said. "Which means I know how he thinks." Diana was quiet on her end, waiting. "I'm going to call him," I said, "and I'm going to tell him something." What I told James that afternoon was this: I had decided to pull back. The whole thing had become too complicated, too risky, and I wasn't willing to put my relationship with Bella in jeopardy over something I couldn't prove. I was going to let Trevor's proposal stop asking questions and focus on being a supportive presence in my daughter's life. I delivered it in the measured, slightly defeated tone of a woman who had weighed her options and chosen the path of least resistance. James listened. He expressed understanding. He said he thought that was probably wise given the circumstances. He said he hoped things would settle down on their own. He was sympathetic in the way that people are when they are also relieved. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat at my kitchen table and waited. I did not have to wait long. 2 hours and 14 minutes after I spoke with James, my phone showed an incoming call from Bella. I let it ring through to voicemail. When I listened to the message, it was not Bella's voice that filled the recording. She had called from her own phone, but Trevor was the one speaking. He had clearly taken the phone from her or been handed it, and his voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. The practiced warmth was entirely gone. What remained was something harder, more pressured, moving quickly through its words, the way water moves when a channel narrows. He said that he had heard I was having second thoughts. He said that was understandable, but that the timing was genuinely difficult right now, that there were commitments in place that depended on the full structure coming together, and that if I needed more reassurance, he was happy to walk me through anything I wasn't clear on. He said Bella wanted me to know how much this meant to both of them. He said he was sure I would make the right decision once I had a chance to think it through properly. He said all of this in the tone of a man who was not actually offering reassurance. He was delivering a message. The warmth was scaffolding, and he had stopped bothering to put it up. I sat in my kitchen after the recording ended and played it again. Then a third time. I listened to Trevor's voice. On that recording, urgent, calculating, stripped of every layer of charm. The fury was there, but underneath it something colder, steadier. Purpose. I knew then that before I faced Trevor, I needed to face someone else first. I chose a coffee shop on Montrose, the kind of place that is always just busy enough that two women having a difficult conversation can do so without being the most interesting thing in the room. I had texted Bella that morning. Nothing alarming, nothing that would put Trevor on notice. Just, "Can we get coffee this afternoon? Just us." "I miss you," she had replied within minutes. "Yes, I'd like that." That reply told me something. The quickness of it, the simplicity. No checking with Trevor first, no hedging about schedules. Just yes, immediately, like she had been waiting to be asked. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with both hands wrapped around a mug, the way she used to sit at my kitchen table when she was in high school, and something was weighing on her. She had always held her coffee like it was keeping her anchored. I sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Just two women who knew each other better than anyone else in the world, sitting in the particular silence of people who have been carefully not saying something for too long. "Hi, baby," I said. "Hi, Mom." I ordered my coffee when the server came by. I took my time with it, letting the quiet settle rather than rushing to fill it. Bella looked out the window at the street for a moment, then back at me, and I could see her working through something, the particular internal negotiation of a person deciding how honest they are willing to be. I decided to make it easier for her. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to know, before I do, that nothing you tell me is going to change how I feel about you. Not one word of it." She looked at me carefully. "Okay," she said. "How did it start?" I asked. "The conversation about my finances. Between you and Trevor. How did that begin?" A long pause. She looked down at her mug. "He brought it up about 2 months after the wedding," she said finally. "He said he had been thinking about ways to stabilize things, the company, our future. He said he had an opportunity that could really help us, but that it required a certain level of initial investment that he wasn't in a position to put together alone right now." She stopped, started again. "He said you had the resources, and that it would be good for you too, that you'd see a real return, that it would be a partnership." "And what did you think?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was too much to ask," she said. "I told him that. I told him it wasn't right to bring you into his business things." "What did he say?" She pressed her lips together. "He said I was being sentimental, that family helping family was how real wealth worked, that I needed to stop thinking like someone who had never had anything and start thinking about our future." She said the last part carefully, like she was reading it from a surface she hadn't looked at in a while. I kept my voice even. Did you know that he was including my property in the documents he showed me? She flinched. It was small, just a slight tightening around the eyes. But I had been reading her face for 31 years. He said it was standard collateral language, she said. He said it was just how these documents are structured and that it didn't mean anything would actually happen to your house. He said it was protective for all of us. And you believed that. Another pause longer this time. I wanted to, she said quietly. There's a difference. That landed between us and stayed there for a moment. Bella, I said, did you ever think about telling me? She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was something raw in her expression. The particular grief of someone who has been carrying a decision they knew was wrong and has run out of ways to justify it to themselves. Every Sunday, she said, every time I called you, I would get off the phone and think I should have said something. I should have just said something. Her voice stayed steady, but only barely. But by the time I understood the full shape of it, it felt like it was too late. Like if I said anything, it would destroy everything. My marriage, your relationship with me, all of it. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. I need to tell you something, I said. And I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. I told her about Sandra Mitchell. Not every detail, just the shape of it. A woman who had trusted the same man. A life that had been methodically taken apart through documents and manufactured trust, and the particular patience of someone who knew how to wait. A physician who had closed her practice and moved to a quiet apartment in Pearland, and spent years learning how to take up less space than she used to. Bella did not speak while I talked. She sat very still, her hands flat on the table. Now her coffee forgotten. When I finished, the silence stretched out, and neither of us moved to fill it. He did this before, she said finally. It was not a question. Yes, she looked out the window. A couple was walking by on the sidewalk outside, laughing about something unhurried. Bella watched them for a moment, with the expression of someone observing a world they had temporarily lost access to. When she looked back at me, her eyes were wet, but her voice was clear. What do I do? She asked. I tightened my hand over hers. I need you to go home, act normal, and do exactly what I tell you, I said quietly. Because in 48 hours, everything changes. Bella looked at me with something I hadn't seen in her eyes for a long time. Trust. Diana's office at 11 o'clock at night looked nothing like it did during business hours. The clean surfaces were gone. In their place was the organized disorder of serious work in progress. Folders spread across the conference table. Printed pages arranged in overlapping rows. 2 laptops open side by side. A half-empty pot of coffee on the credenza that had clearly been made hours ago, and nobody had bothered to replace. Diana's jacket was draped over the back of her chair. Her reading glasses were pushed up on her head. She had the focused, slightly disheveled quality of someone who had been moving fast for a long time and had no intention of stopping. She looked up when I came in and pointed at the coffee. It's old, she said, but it's there. I poured a cup anyway and sat down across from her. We had been building toward this night for days, gathering, verifying, organizing the pieces into something that could stand on its own without requiring anyone to take our word for it. Diana believed, and I had come to agree, that the strength of what we had was not in any single element, but in the accumulation, the pattern, the way each piece connected to the next, in a chain that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. She walked me through what they had assembled. The photographs I had taken of the preliminary contract documents formed the foundation, specific representations Trevor had made in writing, including the collateral clause that referenced real property held by participating investors. Set against those representations was James's financial analysis, which documented the gap between what Trevor had claimed about his company's structure and what the actual filings showed. The recording from Bella's phone added a third layer, Trevor's own voice pressure stripped of polish, making representations about timing and commitments that contradicted what he had told me directly. Taken individually, each piece was suggestive. Together, they described a methodology. This is where Sandra becomes important, Diana said, turning to a section near the back of the folder. Her situation establishes prior conduct. It shows this isn't a single instance of poor judgment or a business that failed through bad luck. It shows a pattern. Sandra had agreed to provide a statement. I had called her 2 days after our meeting in Pearland, and she had picked up on the first ring as though she had been expecting to hear from me again. When I told her what we were building and asked if she would be willing to contribute, what she knew, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I thought she might say no. Then she said, "Yes, it's time." Her statement, Diana explained, covered the key elements of her own experience: the approach, the manufactured trust, the document structure, the outcome. It would not be central to the case Diana was preparing to file, but it provided context that investigators would find significant. It showed that the person they were looking at had done this before, had refined the approach, and had been operating with apparent impunity long enough to try it again. "What about James?" I asked. Diana set down her pen. "I spoke with him this afternoon, after I had used James to deliver false information to Trevor. Diana had reached out to him directly, not with accusations, but with facts. She had laid out what she knew about his prior connection to Trevor, what she believed he had passed along, and what the consequences of that might be if the matter proceeded without his cooperation. She had also told him plainly that there was a path available to him if he chose it. He had chosen it. He'll provide a full account of what he shared with Trevor, and when, Diana said. He'll also corroborate the financial irregularities from his own analysis. In exchange, his involvement is treated as that of a witness rather than a participant." She paused. "He asked me to tell you he was sorry." I nodded slowly. I would deal with what I felt about James at another time. Tonight, there was no room for it. Diana gathered the sections of the folder back into order and aligned them carefully, the way she did when she was about to say something that required the space that came after it. "I submitted the package this afternoon," she said. "Both the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI field office here in Houston. Given the interstate elements of the financial structure and the prior inquiry on record, I expected it to be routed appropriately." "And?" I asked. "I heard back from the FBI at 6 this evening." She looked at me steadily. "They've confirmed receipt. An agent has been assigned. They're moving on their end." The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Houston skyline held its usual nighttime glow. All those lit towers, all that ordinary commerce, continuing on, indifferent to what was being decided in this room. I thought about the morning Trevor had walked into my house with his slide deck and his prepared answers and his practiced smile. I thought about Sandra's apartment with its bare walls. I thought about Bella at the coffee shop, her hands flat on the table, her eyes finally clear. "How long?" I asked. "They've indicated they'll be in a position to act within 48 hours, Diana said, "which means we need everything on our end finalized tonight." We spent another hour going through the remaining details, documentation sequence, the specific representations that were most actionable, the procedural questions Diana needed answered before morning. By the time we finished, the coffee was gone and the city outside had gone quieter. Diana closed the folder with the deliberate care of someone completing something that had required a great deal to complete. She set her pen down. "FBI confirmed. 48 hours. She paused, and then she looked at me with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she had been holding until the right moment. "There's one more thing you need to do before then," she said. "And it's the hardest one." I already knew what she meant. The house was quiet when I got home. Not the uncomfortable quiet of an empty space, but the settled kind. The quiet of a place that has held a life for a long time and carries that history in its walls. The lamp in the living room was still on, from when I had left that morning, throwing its familiar amber light across the floor, the way it always had. Ray had picked that lamp out at an estate sale decades ago, carried it home in the back seat of his truck, and declared it perfect for that corner. I had agreed then. I still did. I set my bag down by the door and stood in the entryway for a moment without moving. The thing Diana had meant, the thing I had known she meant before she finished saying it was this before 48 hours were up and everything moved into the hands of investigators and attorneys and processes that would unfold according to their own logic, I needed to sit with what this actually was. Not the case, not the strategy, the thing underneath all of that. The part that didn't fit into folders or recordings or legal frameworks. The part that was just mine. I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on. While I waited for it, I stood at the counter and looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, the one Bella had taken of the three of us the previous Thanksgiving, her arm outstretched to get us all in the frame. Ray had been gone by then, and it was just me and Bella and my granddaughter, who was wearing a paper turkey crown she had made at school, and was intensely serious about it. We were all laughing. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then, I carried my tea to the dining room table, Ray's table, the one he had refinished himself the year we moved in, sanding it down by hand over a long weekend, while I painted the kitchen, and I sat down in the chair that had always been mine for the first 30 years of our marriage. Ray had sat across from me at this table. Morning coffee, Sunday dinners, the late-night conversations that only happen when a house has gone quiet and two people have nothing left to perform for each other. After he was gone, I had kept sitting in my chair. I had never once sat in his. Tonight I let myself miss him in a way I usually kept managed, not the sharp missing of the early months when his absence was a physical thing, a space in every room that the eye kept returning to. This was older and quieter, the particular grief of wanting to tell someone something and understanding again that the someone you want to tell is not available. I had made it through the past several weeks on discipline and momentum, on the clear-eyed focus that had always served me well in difficult situations. But sitting at that table, in the lamplight, with the work essentially done, and only the final steps remaining, I let the weight of it settle over me. I thought about Bella at 23, calling me from a work trip to tell me she had gotten the promotion she had been working toward for 2 years. Her voice so bright, it seemed to come through the phone as actual light. I thought about the way she used to fall asleep in the car when she was small, going boneless in her car seat, the way children do when they trust completely that they are safe. I thought about my granddaughter arranging her plastic horses in careful circles, narrating their lives in a running whisper, inhabiting a world where grandmothers' houses were permanent and safe, and always exactly where you left them. Then I got up, went to the small desk in the corner of the living room, and found a pen and 2 sheets of paper. I did not plan what I was going to write. I sat back down at the table, and I simply began. The letter was not for Trevor. It was not a document for any legal proceeding or a record of anything that had happened. It was for Bella and for my granddaughter to be read whenever the time was right, maybe soon, maybe years from now, when my granddaughter was old enough to understand it. I wrote about what I believed love actually required. Not the version that asks you to absorb mistreatment in the name of keeping peace, but the kind that is sturdy enough to tell the truth, even when the truth is costly. I wrote about the difference between patience and resignation, how I had confused them myself at certain points, and what it had cost me to learn them apart. I wrote about my granddaughter, about the particular fierceness of wanting a different kind of world. For her, one where she would never have to choose between her own clarity and someone else's comfort. I wrote about Ray, about the way he had always said that the people who love you well are the ones who make it easier to be honest, not harder, about how that had been the standard I had tried to live by, and the one I hoped Bella would find her way back to. Near the end, I wrote something I had been carrying for weeks without quite finding the words for it. I wrote that strength rarely feels like strength when you are in the middle of it, that it mostly feels like responsibility, like the simple, unglamorous work of doing what needs to be done because you are the one who sees it clearly enough to do it. I finished writing and set the pen down. I read it back once, slowly. Then I folded it carefully, 2 even folds, the way Ray had always folded things, with the particular neatness of a man who believed that how you handled small things said something about how you handled everything, and I placed it in the center of the table. I sat with it for a moment. The lamp, the quiet, the photograph on the refrigerator of 3 people laughing on a Thursday afternoon. Then I reached for my phone. I picked up the phone. It was time to make the call that would start the last chapter. The city doesn't make a sound before 5 in the morning. That's something most people never notice. Houston, in the hour before sunrise, before the highways fill, and the coffee shops open their doors, is one of the quietest places on earth. I had lived here for 31 years and never appreciated that silence until that morning, standing at my kitchen window with a mug warming both hands, watching the sky shift from deep navy to the pale gray that comes just before the light breaks. I hadn't slept. Not really. I had lain still for a few hours, eyes closed, letting my body rest, while my mind ran its final checks the way I used to do the night before a major audit back in my banking years. You don't sleep before something like that. You conserve. The coffee was strong. Ray always said I made it too strong, that it would keep me up at night. I used to laugh and tell him that was the point. Standing there alone in the quiet, I almost smiled at the memory. Almost. I carried my mug to the kitchen table. Not Ray's chair, not this morning. This morning, I sat in my own chair, facing the window, and I let myself breathe, slowly, deliberately, the way Diana had reminded me just before I left her office the night before. Whatever you feel in that room tomorrow, keep it below the surface. That's where your power is. She was right. She had been right about most things. At 5:47, I picked up my phone. Trevor answered on the second ring. He always answered quickly when he thought something was moving in his direction. I had learned that about him. A man who moves fast toward opportunity rarely pauses to question whether the opportunity is real. Gloria. His voice was warm, confident, the version of himself he put on like a good suit whenever he needed something. Trevor, I said. I kept my voice easy, unhurried. I've been thinking about the proposal. I've made my decision. Can you come over this afternoon? I'd like to sign the papers. There was a pause, barely half a second, and then I heard it. The shift. The way his exhale changed. Relief wrapped in the careful packaging of composure. Of course, he said. I'll be there. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock, I confirmed. Come to the front door. We said our goodbyes the way people do when they think they understand each other. I set the phone down on the table and sat very still for a moment, listening to the house settle around me. Bella arrived at 9:30. She knocked twice, soft, the way she used to when she was a teenager, coming home past curfew, hoping not to wake me. I opened the door before she could knock a third time. She was wearing a gray pullover and had her hair pulled back, simply no jewelry, no effort at polish. She looked younger than she had in months. She looked like herself. We didn't say much at first. I poured her a cup of coffee, weaker than mine, the way she liked it, and we sat together at the kitchen table. The morning light had fully come in by then, pale and even spreading across the floor in long rectangles. She wrapped both hands around her mug, the same way I had wrapped mine, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be sitting in this same kitchen, doing homework at this same table while I cooked dinner. I reached across and covered her hand with mine. You don't have to say anything, I told her. She nodded once and looked out the window. I know, she said quietly. I just didn't want to be alone today. That was enough. That was everything. We sat together through the morning, mostly in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled, that carries its own weight and its own comfort. Around 11, Bella helped me straighten the living room. She moved a chair, adjusted a lamp. Small things. I let her do it because sometimes keeping your hands busy is the only way to keep the rest of you steady. Diana arrived at 12:15. She came in without ceremony, briefcase in one hand, a legal portfolio tucked under the other arm. She had changed into a charcoal blazer and wore her reading glasses pushed up on her head. I had seen Diana Chen in a courtroom exactly once, 4 years ago, at a deposition for a nonprofit board matter. I remembered thinking then that she was the kind of person who never needed to raise her voice to make a room go quiet. She set her portfolio on the coffee table and looked at both of us. "We're confirmed," she said simply. "Everything is in place." Bella exhaled. I nodded. Diana opened the portfolio and walked us through the sequence. What would happen in what order, where each of us should be positioned, what to say, and what not to say. She had mapped it out with the same precision she brought to everything. Thorough, clean, no wasted motion. We went through it twice. The second time, Bella asked one question. Diana answered it in 2 sentences. After that, there was nothing left to do but wait. The 3 of us moved to the living room. Diana sat in the armchair nearest the window with her materials. Bella took the end of the couch closest to the hallway. I sat across from the front door, where I would have a clear view of anyone who walked through it. At 1:50, I smoothed my slacks, set my hands in my lap, and let the quiet of the house settle over me one final time. At 2 o'clock exactly, the doorbell rang. The sound moved through the house, the way sound does, in a room where everyone has been waiting for it, clean and sharp, landing in the silence, like a stone dropped into still water. None of us moved immediately. We let it ring once. Then I stood, walked to the front door, and opened it. Trevor walked through my front door, wearing his best smile, a folder tucked under his arm, completely certain of how this afternoon would end. I stepped aside to let him in. "Make yourself comfortable," I said. And I meant it, because comfort, I had learned, makes people careless. He moved like a man who had already won. That was the first thing I noticed when Trevor settled into the armchair across from me. Not nervousness, not hesitation, but the particular ease of someone who believes the outcome has already been decided. He set his folder on the coffee table with one clean motion, flipped it open, and laid out 3 documents in a row, the way a dealer lays out cards. Practiced. Deliberate. He had done this before. "I think you'll find everything straightforward," he said, clasping his hands together. "We structured it to protect your position as much as ours." I looked at the documents without touching them. "Walk me through it," I said. "From the beginning, every clause." He didn't hesitate. That was the thing about Trevor. He never hesitated when he thought he had the advantage. He began with the first page, explaining the terms in the smooth, unhurried voice of a man who had rehearsed this. Investment vehicle structure, asset-backed collateral provisions, staged release of funds tied to project benchmarks. He used words designed to sound reassuring, while meaning something else entirely, and he said them with the confidence of someone who had never once been asked to slow down and explain them. I let him talk. I asked measured questions, the kind a cautious investor asks, not the kind a former bank director asks. I wanted him comfortable. I wanted him thorough. I wanted every word on record, because my phone was already recording. It had been recording since the moment he sat down. He was 15 minutes in midway through the 3rd document when I asked the questions he had been holding in reserve since he walked through the door. "Trevor," I said, keeping my voice even, "before we go further, I'd like to ask you about Sandra Mitchell." The shift was immediate, not dramatic. Trevor was too practiced for dramatic. But I had spent 3 decades reading people across conference tables, and I knew exactly what it looked like when someone's internal calculation changed mid-sentence. His hands, which had been moving to gesture toward the document, went still. His jaw set just slightly. The warmth in his eyes didn't disappear. It recalibrated, became something cooler, more watchful. "I'm not sure I know that name," he said. "I think you do," I replied. A beat of silence. He looked at me differently, then, reassessing the way you reassess a room when you realize the furniture has been moved. "Gloria," he said, and his voice shifted register, dropping the investor meeting warmth. "I want to make sure we stay focused on why we're here today." "We are focused," I said. "Sandra Mitchell, your first marriage, the assets that disappeared when it ended." Something moved behind his eyes. He looked briefly at Bella, who was sitting quietly at the end of the couch. She met his gaze and didn't look away. That was the moment his composure began to fracture. "This is not what this meeting was supposed to be," he said, his voice tightening. He leaned forward. "I came here in good faith. I came here because you called me. And now you're sitting here with..." He stopped reset. When he spoke again, the words came out measured, but pressurized, like steam through a narrow valve. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing here, because I will make sure you don't see that little girl again if you push this. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? He meant my granddaughter. I had expected this. Diana had told me when a man like Trevor feels the walls closing, he reaches for whatever he thinks you love most. I had prepared for it. I had told myself I was prepared for it. Even so, hearing him say it, watching him weaponize a 5-year-old child in the same breath as his business documents required everything I had to stay seated, to keep my hands still, to let the moment exist without reacting to it. I reached forward and picked up my phone from the cushion beside me. I set it on the coffee table face up between us. The recording application was visible on the screen. The timer had been running for 22 minutes. Trevor looked at it. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had come before it in that room. It had a different weight, a different temperature. He stood up. He gathered the documents from the table in one motion, not clean. This time, the practiced precision gone, and pushed them into his folder. He walked to the entryway, and for a moment, I thought he would simply leave. Then he turned. He looked at me from across the room, and what was in his expression had shed every remaining layer of performance. No smile, no warmth, no careful calibration. Just the stripped version of him that Sandra had seen, that Bella had slowly come to know, that he had worked very hard to keep hidden from me. "You have no idea what you're doing, old woman," he said. I stood up. I am not a tall person. I have never needed to be. I straightened to my full height and looked across the room at him, without flinching, without hurrying my words. "Actually, Trevor," I said quietly, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and so do they." The front door opened. 2 individuals stepped inside, a man and a woman, both in professional attire, both carrying credentials they displayed in the same unhurried motion. They introduced themselves as federal agents and stated they were there in connection with an ongoing financial fraud investigation. Their voices were courteous and entirely without warmth. They had the particular manner of people who have done this many times and feel no need to perform it. Trevor didn't run. He didn't shout. He stood very still in the entryway for a moment, folder in hand, and looked around the room at me, at Bella, at Diana, who had risen from her armchair and was now standing quietly near the window with her portfolio closed. Then he let the folder drop to his side. One of the agents said his name. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, and walked toward the door. Trevor's face, in that moment, I will never forget it. Not the anger, not the shock, the realization, the slow, terrible understanding that the woman he had spent 8 months trying to outmaneuver had been 10 steps ahead of him the entire time. The agents were gone by 3:15. I know that because I looked at the clock on the wall, the small wooden one Ray had picked up at a market in San Antonio the summer before he passed, and I noticed the time, the way you notice small, ordinary things in the aftermath of something large. The hand said 3:15. The light through the front windows was still the full, unhurried gold of a Houston afternoon, indifferent to everything that had just happened inside this house. Bella and I sat in the living room without speaking. The furniture was where it had always been. The room looked exactly as it had that morning, except that one chair had been shifted slightly, and there were faint marks on the coffee table, where documents had been laid out and then removed. Diana had slipped out quietly, behind the agents, pressing my hand once before she left. She didn't need to say anything. Neither did I. Bella's coffee cup was on the side table, beside her, untouched and long past warm. She was looking at nothing in particular, the middle distance, the way people look when they are processing something too large to take in all at once. I understood that look. I had worn it myself months ago, standing in a parking garage, after James first told me about the financial irregularities. The world keeps its shape, but everything inside it shifts. After a while, I got up and carried both cups to the kitchen. I poured them out and stood at the sink for a moment, listening to the house. It was quiet, in a different way than it had been that morning. The morning quiet had been held together by anticipation. This quiet was something else, looser, heavier, the kind that settles in after a thing has finally run its course. In the days that followed, information came to us in pieces. Diana called on the third day to report that the federal investigation was formally underway. Trevor faced charges connected to investment fraud, specifically the structured misrepresentation of collateral assets across multiple agreements, the same pattern James had flagged in that first quiet meeting at Greenway Plaza. His startup was placed under regulatory review and its operations suspended pending the outcome. Diana explained this in her usual way, clear, sequential, no unnecessary weight given to the dramatic parts. She had seen cases like this before. She knew how they moved. Sandra Mitchell received word through her own attorney the following week. Diana had made sure of it. She believed Sandra deserved to know, not as a formality, but as something real. I wasn't there when Sandra got the call, but her attorney passed along a message through Diana. It said simply, "Thank you. I had stopped expecting this." I read those words twice and set the message down on the kitchen table. There are things people carry silently for years, not because they are weak, but because they were given no other option. Sandra had carried hers for a long time, knowing that the weight had finally been lifted, even partially, even imperfectly, meant more to me than I had anticipated. James Okafor met with federal investigators twice in the 2 weeks that followed. He had retained his own legal representation and cooperated fully, providing documentation and testimony that corroborated the larger pattern of fraudulent conduct. His situation was not simple. He had made choices that compromised people he cared about, and he would have to live with that. But because his involvement had been driven by pressure, rather than predatory intent, and because of the substance of what he provided, the legal consequences he faced were significantly reduced. We did not speak during that period. I suspected we would eventually, but not yet. Bella filed the paperwork 3 weeks after that afternoon. She did it on a Tuesday in the late morning with her own attorney present. She told me about it that evening over the phone, her voice steadier than I expected. She had found legal representation through Diana's referral, someone who specialized in cases where financial entanglement made dissolution complicated. The process would take time. These things always do. But the first step had been taken. And in situations like hers, the first step is often the hardest. Custody of her daughter, my granddaughter, was addressed as part of the proceedings. Given the nature of the federal investigation and the documentation that had been gathered, Bella's attorney was confident in the outcome. I did not allow myself to think too far ahead on that front. I had learned, over the course of those 8 months, that certainty is a thing you earn in small increments, not something you claim in advance. What I focused on instead was the present, the Tuesday calls that began again regular as they had once been. The Sunday afternoon, Bella drove over and we made dinner together in my kitchen. For the first time in almost a year, nothing elaborate, just pasta and the crusty bread she had liked since she was a teenager, and the particular kind of conversation that happens between two people who have been through something difficult together and are finding their way back to ordinary life. She was different, not broken. I want to be precise about that. Different in the way that people are different after they have seen something clearly that they once refused to see. Quieter, in some ways, more deliberate. She asked questions she would not have asked a year ago, and she listened to the answers with her full attention. I watched her across my kitchen table and felt something I had not let myself feel in a long time. Not relief exactly, though that was part of it. Something closer to recognition. My daughter finding herself again, one ordinary evening at a time. It was on one of those evenings, sometime in the 5th week, that she said what she said. We had finished eating and were sitting with what remained of our drinks, the kitchen comfortable, and lit warmly against the early dark outside. She had been quiet for a few minutes, and I had not pushed. I had learned to let silence be. Then she looked at me. "Mom," she said softly, "I'm sorry I didn't trust you sooner. I shook my head. You trusted me when it mattered most, I said. That's enough. That's everything. She held my gaze for a moment, and then she nodded a slow, deliberate nod. The kind that means a person has heard something and decided to keep it, to carry it forward. Outside, the Houston evening settled in the way it does in the weeks before the seasons shift. Warm, still, but with something new at the edges, a faint suggestion of change on the way. I reached across the table and refilled her glass. Houston, in late autumn, has a particular quality of light. It comes in low and unhurried in the late afternoon, the kind that doesn't demand your attention, but rewards it if you pay it. It turns ordinary things, briefly, quietly, beautiful, a park bench, a gravel path, a child running across an open lawn. I had lived here long enough to take that light for granted. That afternoon, sitting on a bench near the tree line with my granddaughter, somewhere ahead of me, chasing something she called a bird, I was glad I no longer did. I had folded the letter into the front pocket of my jacket before we left the house. I hadn't planned to read it again. I nearly had it memorized by then. But sitting there in that pale afternoon light, I took it out anyway. The paper was worn soft at the folds. I smoothed it open across my knee and read slowly, not for information, but for the particular comfort of your own words, given back to you at the right moment. To Bella, and to the little girl who will one day be old enough to understand this. Real love does not ask you to make yourself smaller. It does not arrive with conditions attached to your peace or price tags on your trust. Silence is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is wait until they know exactly what they are looking for, and then look without flinching. I stopped at that line, the same place I always stopped. It had taken me the longest to write. It was the line I most needed to have written. I thought about the 8 months that had brought me to this bench. Not about Trevor. I found, increasingly, that I thought about him less and less. What I thought about was myself, the woman who had sat in a glass-walled office listening to numbers that didn't add up and smiled anyway. The woman who had written careful observations in a small notebook and then questioned whether she had any right to be suspicious at all. The woman who had stood in a parking structure on an ordinary weekday and understood for the first time the full shape of what she was facing. I had second-guessed myself at nearly every step. What I hadn't expected, more than the legal complexity, more than the betrayal, was how persistently I would doubt my own perception. How many times I would tell myself I was overreacting, seeing patterns that weren't there. The patterns were real, and the most important decision I made across those 8 months was not the legal strategy, not the carefully timed confrontation. It was the first one, the decision to trust what I observed over what I was told. That is not a small thing. For a lot of people, it is the hardest thing. Bella had enrolled in a professional development program the month before organizational consulting building on skills she already had. She mentioned it matter-of-factly, the way she mentioned most things now, as if it were simply the next step, rather than a significant act of reclaiming her own direction. I didn't make a fuss. I understood she needed it to feel ordinary, to belong fully to her. But I noticed I had been keeping a different kind of record all along, not of wrongs, but of returns. The way she finished her own sentences, the way she pushed back gently, but clearly, when she disagreed, the way she looked at her daughter with an uncomplicated openness that had been absent too long. She was going to be all right. I had known it since that coffee shop in Montrose. She had always been stronger than she believed. She had needed to see it proven by something she couldn't argue with. My granddaughter appeared, without warning, closing the distance, the way small children do, suddenly, completely, no preamble. She crashed into my side and wrapped both arms around me. "I didn't find the bird," she announced into my shoulder. "I know," I said. "It was fast. They usually are." She pulled back, gave me the frank appraisal. Children reserved for adults. They are deciding whether to trust, then climbed up onto the bench and leaned against my arm without another word. I folded the letter and put it back in my pocket. I thought about Ray then, not with the ache that used to come automatically, but with something quieter, something that felt less like loss and more like continuity. He had been gone over 2 years, and in that time, I had managed a grief, a threat to my family, a betrayal, and a reconciliation. I had done it without him beside me, which was not the way I would have chosen. But I had done it. "I think you'd be all right with how this ended," I told him. "The way you speak to the people who remain in the part of yourself that doesn't require words." I imagined him answering, "I never had any doubt about that. There is something I have confirmed, if not learned, across these months, about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It builds in the ordinary moments, the decision to write something down, instead of dismiss it, the willingness to make a difficult call, the choice to stay steady when everything in you wants to react. It builds in the long middle of difficult things where nobody is watching and there is no sign yet that anything you're doing is working. If you are sitting with something unresolved right now, something that keeps returning to your attention, something you keep talking yourself out of trusting, hear this. Your instincts are not nothing. You do not need all the answers before you begin. You only need to be willing to look without flinching. That is always where it starts. If this story found you today, if any part of it felt true or familiar or like something you needed, I would love to know. Leave a word below. Tell me where you're watching from. It means more than you might think. My granddaughter had drifted into a light doze against my arm by the time the sun dropped below the tree line. I stayed very still, watching the last of the light cross the lawn. Some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. But some things, the things that matter most, they don't break. They bend, and then, slowly, beautifully, they grow back, stronger than before. I held her a little closer and let the evening come in.